The night of the 14th of October, 1942, offers no moon. At an altitude of just 200 feet above the English Channel, a Bristol Beaufort torpedo bomber skims the surface of the water so closely that the crew can feel the cold, salt air rising through the airframe. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant David Kenyon, holds his course with a precision born of months of training over Scottish lochs and the Irish Sea. Ahead, invisible in the absolute darkness, lies the French coastline. And somewhere along it, a convoy of German merchant vessels hugging the shore under the protection of flak batteries, E-boats, and most critically, the interlocking arcs of searchlights that have so far made night attack against such targets a lethal impossibility for the Royal Air Force. The navigator calls a bearing. Kenyon adjusts fractionally. The engines throb at reduced power, their noise swallowed by the vast indifference of the sea. 30 seconds out from the estimated position of the convoy, something extraordinary happens. From a container mounted beneath the Beaufort's fuselage, a device begins to function. It makes no sound audible to the crew. It produces no flash visible to the enemy. But within the space of a few heartbeats, the German searchlight operators who have been scanning the darkness for exactly this kind of intruder suddenly find that their instruments have failed them. Not jammed, not destroyed, simply rendered useless by a phenomenon they cannot yet identify or counter. The searchlights continue to sweep. The crews continue to operate their equipment. But the beams, which should be stabbing outward with their familiar blue-white brilliance, seem somehow degraded, diffused, robbed of their reach and their lethal certainty. Kenyon's Beaufort releases its torpedo. The weapon runs true. Moments later, a column of water and flame rises from the darkness ahead, and the aircraft banks hard to the north, climbing away into the same concealing night that has just become, for the first time, a genuine ally rather than merely a neutral accomplice. Nobody on the German shore has been able to fix the aircraft's position. Nobody has been able to illuminate it for the flak crews. The searchlights, for all their mechanical faithfulness, have been blinded. The device that achieved this result is today almost entirely forgotten outside the narrow circles of specialist aviation historians. It has no glamorous name. It did not win the war, nor did it produce the kind of dramatic imagery that fills museum galleries and documentary archives. Yet for a critical period during the coastal warfare of the Second World War, it represented a genuinely novel solution to one of the most persistent and murderous problems facing low-level RAF strike aircraft operating over German-held waters. The devastating efficiency of coordinated searchlight defenses that could illuminate, hold, and deliver an attacking aircraft to the waiting guns within seconds of detection. The solution was called the turbine light, and later, in its airborne form adapted for the strike role, a variant of what crews came to know simply as the Lee light's difficult northern cousin, though the weapon that truly addressed the searchlight problem at coastal level was something altogether more specific, more ingenious, and more obscure. To understand why such a device was necessary, one must first appreciate the mathematical brutality of the situation facing RAF Coastal Command and its strike squadrons during the middle years of the war. By 1941, German coastal convoys operating along the occupied European seaboard had developed a defensive system of remarkable sophistication. The fundamental principle was elegantly simple. Since attacking aircraft could not strike what they could not see, and since nighttime eliminated the visual acquisition that made daylight attack possible, the obvious solution was to operate convoys under cover of darkness while maintaining along the coastline a network of searchlights capable of illuminating any attacker the moment it came within striking range. The searchlights employed were typically of the 150 centimeter or 200 centimeter naval pattern, capable of projecting a beam of approximately 800 million candle power to a useful range of between 4,000 and 6,000 meters in clear conditions. They were operated in overlapping clusters so that if one beam acquired a target, adjacent lights could rapidly converge to create a cone of illumination from which escape was, in practice, extraordinarily difficult. The flak batteries positioned within the same defensive perimeter were pre-registered on the likely attack corridors, meaning that once an aircraft was lit, the gunnery solution required only a few seconds confirmation before fire could be brought to bear with lethal accuracy. The statistics accumulated from early RAF attempts at night coastal operations were, by any measure, appalling. During the period between October 1941 and March 1942, strike operations by Beaufort and Hampton torpedo bombers against German shipping off the Dutch, Danish, and Norwegian coasts produced aircraft loss rates that the mathematics of attrition rendered unsustainable within a matter of months. Analysis conducted by the Operational Research Section at Coastal Command Headquarters at Northwood revealed that of aircraft which were illuminated by searchlights for more than 12 seconds at low level, approximately 73% were either destroyed outright or so severely damaged as to prevent them completing their attack runs. The figure for aircraft illuminated for between 5 and 12 seconds was scarcely more encouraging at around 47%. Only those crews who escaped illumination entirely, or who were held for fewer than 5 seconds, demonstrated survivability rates that permitted any realistic calculation of long-term operational viability. The challenge, reduced to its essentials, was this: attacking aircraft needed to approach their targets at low level, at relatively slow speeds dictated by the requirements of torpedo aiming and release, in darkness, whilst somehow preventing the searchlight operators from performing the function their equipment was designed to perform. The solution seemed, on first consideration, to range from the impossible to the absurd. One could not bomb the searchlights themselves without first seeing them, and seeing them meant being seen. One could not fly above their range without abandoning the entire tactical basis of torpedo attack. One could not rely on cloud cover or atmospheric conditions as operational constants. The challenge seemed insurmountable. The solution emerged from an unlikely source, and it drew upon a principle of optics that had been understood theoretically for decades, but had never been applied in this specific operational context. The principle was dazzle, not in the decorative sense employed by First World War naval camouflage designers, but in the precise physiological sense of temporary retinal saturation induced by exposure to an intense light source. A human eye that has been subjected to a sudden, overwhelming burst of white light of sufficient intensity and duration does not merely experience discomfort. It experiences a genuine and involuntary loss of visual acuity lasting between several seconds and several minutes, depending upon the intensity of the stimulus and the degree of dark adaptation previously achieved by the observer. This last factor was crucial. A searchlight operator who has been scanning dark water and dark sky for the past 30 minutes has achieved a high degree of dark adaptation. His eyes have adjusted to low light conditions through a process involving the regeneration of photosensitive pigments in the retinal rods, a process that takes approximately 20 to 30 minutes to complete fully, and that produces a genuine increase in visual sensitivity of several orders of magnitude. The same operator, exposed to a sudden intense flash, loses this adaptation immediately and completely. The regeneration must begin again from the beginning. For the duration of that regeneration, which in practical terms means for the 30 or more seconds following the flash stimulus, and partially for several minutes beyond, his ability to acquire and track a fast-moving, low-altitude aircraft in the darkness is severely compromised. The weapon designed to exploit this physiological vulnerability was, in its engineering fundamentals, deceptively simple. It was a powerful flashbulb array, a system of high-intensity photographic flash tubes arranged to discharge simultaneously in a single burst of white light of sufficient intensity to saturate the dark, adapted eyes of any observers within a forward arc of approximately 60 degrees, at ranges up to 1,500 meters. The device was compact enough to be mounted beneath the fuselage, or in the nose of a medium bomber, it consumed electrical power only at the moment of discharge, and it required no moving parts, no complex aiming mechanism, and no specialized crew training beyond the straightforward tactical procedure of deploying it at the correct point in the attack run. The engineering behind the device drew upon work already being conducted in Britain's photographic reconnaissance and press photography industries, where the development of high-intensity flash tubes for aerial night photography had produced components capable of generating extremely short-duration light pulses of extraordinary brightness. The xenon flash tube technology that had been advancing through the late 1930s could produce pulses of between 1,500 and 5,000 joules of light energy in durations measured in milliseconds, bursts too brief to be photographically recorded by the human eye as anything other than an instantaneous blaze, yet sufficient to induce the retinal saturation effect upon which the entire tactical concept depended. The development program was conducted under the auspices of the Telecommunications Research Establishment at WWII in Dorset, later relocated to Malvern, where a small team of scientists and engineers working under conditions of considerable secrecy produced successive prototypes during 1941. The lead scientist associated with the project was Dr. Arthur Hartley, a physicist whose pre-war work on photographic instrumentation had given him an unusually intimate understanding of the human visual system's response to light stimuli across different wavelength and intensity ranges. Hartley's contribution was not merely the engineering of the flash tube array itself, but the systematic experimental work that established the precise intensity, duration, and spectral composition of the flash required to achieve reliable dazzle at operationally relevant ranges and under the variety of atmospheric conditions encountered over the North Sea and the English Channel. The experimental program was conducted in conditions of some difficulty, partly because recruiting human subjects willing to have their dark adapted eyes subjected to repeated intense light. Flashes was not, as Hartley's own notes acknowledge with characteristic British understatement, a straightforward matter of personnel selection, and partly because the operational parameters, night, low altitude, fast-moving target, variable atmospheric haze, were not easily replicated in a laboratory environment. Testing was ultimately carried out using searchlight crews from the Royal Artillery, who were, in exchange for their cooperation, informed that the program involved the evaluation of improved night vision aids. Whether this represented a complete account of the research objectives is a matter on which the available records offer a certain diplomatic ambiguity. By early 1942, a device designated the Anti-Searchlight Flash Projector, or ASFP, had progressed through bench testing and ground trials to the point where airborne evaluation could begin. The initial installation was fitted to a Bristol Beaufort of No. 42 Squadron at RAF Leuchars in Fife, chosen partly because the squadron was engaged in anti-shipping operations against German convoys in the North Sea and the Skagerrak, where the searchlight problem was particularly acute, and partly because the unit's commanding officer, Wing Commander St. John Mayfield, had personally experienced the devastating efficiency of German searchlight defenses during operations in 1941 and was, in consequence, enthusiastically supportive of any program that promised even a partial solution. The airborne trials revealed several problems that required solution before the device could be considered operationally viable. The primary difficulty was electrical. The capacitor bank required to store sufficient energy for the flash discharge was, in the initial prototype, both heavy and bulky to a degree that imposed an unacceptable penalty on aircraft performance. The first installation added approximately 340 pounds to the Beaufort's all-up weight, a figure that, on an aircraft already operating close to its performance margins when carrying a torpedo and a full fuel load for long-range North Sea operations, was simply too high. The engineering team at Worth Matravers reduced this through successive iterations to approximately 180 pounds by the summer of 1942, partly through the development of more energy-dense capacitor technology, and partly through the elimination of redundant protective circuitry, whose removal, in the engineering team's assessment, represented an acceptable operational risk. A second problem was tactical rather than technical. The flash, while effective at the ranges tested, needed to be deployed at a specific point in the attack geometry, close enough to the searchlight position to produce effective dazzle, but not so late in the approach that the aircraft had already been acquired and the gun solution established. Analysis suggested an optimal deployment range of between 800 and 1,200 meters from the searchlight cluster, which, in the context of a low-level torpedo attack at typical approach, speeds of around 180 knots, meant that the crew had approximately 10 to 15 seconds from flash deployment to torpedo release. Crews needed to fly straight and level for the final portion of this approach, maintaining the precise altitude and heading required for torpedo accuracy, in the knowledge that they were visible on radar and that their attack profile was entirely predictable. The flash bought them time. It did not buy them certainty. The device entered limited operational service with Coastal Command strike wings in the autumn of 1942. Initial deployment was confined to 3 squadrons: No. 42 Squadron at Leuchars, No. 86 Squadron operating Beaufort variants from St. Eval in Cornwall against Bay of Biscay and Channel targets, and No. 489 Squadron of the Royal New Zealand Air Force, based at Leuchars alongside No. 42. The operational instructions emphasized that the ASFP was to be regarded as a supplementary defensive aid rather than a primary weapon, to be employed in conjunction with other elements of the strike package: low-level approach, tactical surprise, coordinated multi-aircraft attacks, rather than in isolation. No commander within Coastal Command seriously suggested that the flash projector represented a complete solution to the searchlight problem. It was, however, a meaningful partial solution, and in the arithmetic of operational aviation in 1942, meaningful partial solutions were not to be dismissed. The first confirmed operational use under combat conditions occurred on the night of the 3rd of November, 1942, during an anti-shipping strike against a German convoy off the Dutch Frisian island of Texel. 4 Beauforts from No. 86 Squadron attacked a group of merchant vessels escorted by flagships and small naval craft, with the convoy track illuminated by a shore-based searchlight battery at Den Helder. The lead aircraft deployed its flash projector at an estimated range of 900 meters from the primary searchlight cluster. Post-mission debriefing by the surviving crews, 3 of the 4 Beauforts returned, with the 4th failing to return for reasons that could not be attributed specifically to searchlight acquisition, indicated that the searchlights had visibly wavered following the flash deployment, and that their acquisition of the attacking aircraft had been delayed by what crews estimated as 15 to 20 seconds. That interval, modest as it sounds, was operationally significant. 15 seconds at 180 knots covers approximately 1.3 nautical miles. It represents the difference between an aircraft being acquired before it reaches its torpedo release point and an aircraft being illuminated only after it has already released its weapon. The mathematics were, if not comfortable, at least somewhat less brutal than they had been. Over the following 6 months, the ASFP was employed in approximately 40 confirmed strike operations, with analysis suggesting that in those cases where the device was deployed under conditions broadly matching its design parameters, clear to moderate visibility, approach heading within 30 degrees of the searchlight bearing, deployment altitude below 300 feet, the rate of aircraft loss to searchlight-directed flak was reduced by an estimated 35 to 40%, compared with historical loss rates for equivalent operations conducted without the device. These figures came with substantial caveats. The sample size was modest, the baseline comparison was imperfect, since aircraft equipped with the ASFP were also, by definition, more recently trained crews operating with more current tactical doctrine, and the enemy was, as always, adaptive. The German response to the new device was initially characterized by the kind of institutional confusion that attends any genuinely novel tactical development. The searchlight operators along the Channel and North Sea coasts began experiencing what their maintenance crews interpreted as equipment malfunctions, inexplicable failures of visual performance during otherwise straightforward operational periods. It was some weeks before the pattern was recognized and reported upward through the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe command structure, and several weeks more before the correct interpretation that the RAF was deploying some form of dazzle device against the searchlight crews was accepted as the probable explanation over competing hypotheses involving atmospheric anomalies and electrical interference. Once the correct interpretation was accepted, the German countermeasures were logical and relatively swift. The most effective response was the introduction of improved eye protection for searchlight operators in the form of dark-adapted goggles designed to be worn during the approach phase of an attack, but removed the moment a target was acquired, a procedure that required a degree of anticipatory skill and that introduced its own complications, since the crew wearing the goggles were, by definition, operating with reduced visual acuity during precisely the period when early detection of an incoming aircraft was most valuable. The second countermeasure was the development of overlapping searchlight deployment patterns designed to ensure that even if one crew was temporarily blinded, adjacent lights could be slewed onto the estimated target position and re-illuminated from a different bearing, an approach that exploited the device's directional limitation, since it dazzled only those observers facing broadly towards the source. By mid-1943, the effectiveness of the ASFP had declined measurably as German searchlight crews adapted their operating procedures, and the novelty of the device was exhausted. Coastal Command's operational analysis concluded that the device remained useful as one element within a broader tactical approach, but could no longer be relied upon to produce the reliable suppression of searchlight effectiveness that had characterized its earlier operational employment. The analysis was characteristically measured in its conclusions. The device has rendered useful service, and its continued deployment is recommended, whilst noting that its efficacy as a standalone defensive measure has been reduced by enemy procedural adaptations. This measured verdict was fair. The ASFP had never been presented as anything more than a partial solution, and partial solutions in the context of the unceasing tactical evolution of a major war have a finite lifespan. What deserves emphasis is how quickly, and from what relatively limited resources, the device had progressed from an idea rooted in physiological observation to a fielded operational capability. The entire development cycle from initial scientific proposal to squadron deployment had occupied approximately 18 months, a timeline that reflected both the urgency of the operational requirement and the organizational agility of the British scientific defense establishment during this period. The broader context in which the ASFP should be understood is that of the sustained campaign by Coastal Command's strike wings against German coastal shipping, a campaign that has received considerably less historical attention than the strategic bombing offensive or the Battle of the Atlantic, yet which represented, in the cumulative arithmetic of German merchant shipping losses, a contribution of genuine strategic significance. The German coastal convoy system, which transported iron ore from Scandinavia, coal along the Channel routes, and a variety of military and economic cargoes between occupied ports, was not merely a logistical convenience. It was a strategic necessity, particularly for the supply of Sweden's iron ore to Germany's steel industry, and its disruption, sustained, costly, attritional disruption, placed real constraints on German industrial production during the critical middle years of the war. The strike wings paid a terrible price for this campaign. Between 1940 and 1945, Coastal Command lost several hundred aircraft and their crews in anti-shipping operations, with loss rates per sortie that frequently exceeded those of the strategic bombing force and that, in specific operational periods, approached levels that would have been unsustainable had they continued indefinitely. The ASFP was one of several technical and tactical innovations developed to reduce these losses, alongside advances in low-level torpedo aiming, improvements in formation tactics, the introduction of rocket projectiles as an alternative to torpedoes, and the development of dedicated anti-flak suppression aircraft to accompany strike formations. Each of these developments addressed a portion of the problem. None addressed it entirely. The Allied response in other theaters to the fundamental problem of night searchlight defenses was instructive as a comparative study. In the Mediterranean, where the American 9th Air Force and the RAF's Desert Air Force faced broadly similar challenges during operations against Axis shipping and coastal installations, the preferred American solution was characteristically different in emphasis, focusing on the development of more effective radar-guided bombing to reduce the need for visual acquisition at all, rather than attempting to neutralize the searchlights themselves. The Royal Australian Air Force, operating Bristol Beaufighters in the Southwest Pacific against Japanese coastal traffic, developed a different approach still, exploiting the Beaufighters' speed and firepower to suppress searchlight positions by direct attack in the opening moments of a strike, a solution that was effective, but that required the willingness to accept the losses associated with the initial moments of illumination. The Soviet Navy's Black Sea Fleet, facing similar challenges in operations against Axis shipping between Crimea and Romania during 1942 and 1943, developed what was perhaps the most pragmatic response of all, accepting illumination as essentially inevitable and training crews to continue their attack runs regardless, relying upon speed, low altitude, and aggressive evasion to survive the searchlight exposure. The loss rates this approach produced were not presented in available Soviet operational records with a transparency that permits confident comparison, but the anecdotal accounts suggest they were, by any standard, formidable. What made the British ASFP approach distinctive was its acceptance that the human operator was the critical vulnerability in the searchlight system, not the equipment, not the communications, not the command structure, but the physiologically constrained eyes of the men looking through the eyepieces of the control instruments. This insight, which seems obvious in retrospect, was not so obvious at the time. The RAF's early attempts to address the searchlight problem had focused almost exclusively on the equipment, on jamming the radar that cued the lights, on attacking the electrical supply that powered them, on developing aircraft profiles that were harder to detect at close range. The ASFP represented a conceptual shift, an acknowledgement that the most direct path to degrading the system was to degrade the organic component that no amount of engineering could remove from the essential loop. In this sense, the device anticipated a conceptual approach to system vulnerabilities that would become increasingly central to electronic warfare, information warfare, and ultimately the cognitive dimension operations of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The recognition that complex technical systems almost always contain, somewhere within them, a human being performing a function that no technology of the relevant period can fully automate, and that this human being brings to the system all of the vulnerabilities and limitations that human biology implies. By 1944, with the shift in Allied air supremacy making daylight operations increasingly viable, and with the introduction of more capable radar and navigation systems reducing coastal command's dependence on purely visual attack methods, the ASFP faded from prominence. A small number of the devices survived the war in storage at RAF maintenance units, and at least 2 examples were retained for evaluation by the Air Fighting Development Unit at Boscombe Down, where they attracted modest interest as part of broader research into non-lethal means of degrading enemy defensive capabilities. After the war, the technology was examined by several national air arms with a view to potential post-war development, but the emergence of radar-guided surface-to-air missiles as the dominant air defense challenge of the Cold War period rendered the specific tactical context for which the ASFP had been developed effectively obsolete, and the program was quietly closed. No example of the anti-searchlight flash projector is known to survive in any museum collection. The primary technical documentation relating to its development, the research reports from Worth Matravers, the engineering drawings, the operational analysis reports, is held partly at the Public Record Office at Kew and partly in the records of what became the Royal Signals and Radar Establishment, transferred to Malvern. Some of this material remains, even now, partially restricted under provisions that reflect the original classification of the program rather than any continuing operational sensitivity. The individual scientists who worked on the device are largely unknown by name to the general public. Dr. Hartley's obituary in the Journal of the Physical Society, published in 1978, mentions his wartime work with characteristic vagueness as contributions to the application of photometric principles in the development of night defensive aids, a phrase that technically accurate yet heroically understated in a way that would have been entirely appropriate to its subject. The operational crews who flew with the device and who owe to it a portion of the slender margin of survival that allowed them to return from operations they might otherwise not have survived, are today almost exclusively gone. The last known surviving pilot of No. 42 Squadron who flew torpedo strikes equipped with the ASFP died in 2019, and his account of the device, recorded in the 1990s for the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive, describes it with the matter-of-fact acceptance that characterizes the recollections of men who experienced such things not as history, but as operational necessity. You pressed the button, the thing went off, and with a bit of luck, the chap behind the searchlight couldn't see you properly for a moment. That was the idea. Whether it worked rather depended on the night. It is difficult to imagine a more perfectly British formulation of the relationship between technological ingenuity and the fundamental contingency of combat. The ASFP worked often enough to be worth having, often enough to represent a genuine addition to the survival prospects of the men who carried it, and not so often that it permitted any comforting illusions about the fundamental nature of the enterprise in which those men were engaged. It reduced the probability of being killed by a measurable amount. It did not eliminate it. There is a lesson in this that extends beyond the specific history of a forgotten optical device and the forgotten campaign in which it was deployed. The history of military technology is populated, at its fringes and in its footnotes, with devices and techniques and innovations that achieved modest results under difficult conditions, that did not change the course of the war, did not inspire dramatic names or popular histories, and did not find their way into the consciousness of subsequent generations. Many of these innovations were nonetheless genuine acts of intellectual and engineering ingenuity, produced by men and women working under pressure of time and resource and urgency, responding to problems whose solutions were not obvious and whose consequences of failure were measured in human lives. The anti-searchlight flash projector was one of these. It took a fact of human physiology that had been known for decades and applied it to a tactical problem that was killing aircrew at an unsustainable rate, in a form compact enough to be carried on the aircraft most directly affected, simple enough to be operated without specialized training, and effective enough to reduce losses by a margin that, accumulated over the 40-odd operations in which it was employed during its most productive period, represents the difference between several aircraft destroyed and several aircraft returned. A few dozen men, most of whose names are now recorded only in the casualty appendices and operational record books of units that no longer exist, flew home at night across the Channel because a physicist in Dorset had thought carefully about the physiology of the human eye, and an engineer in a workshop had found a way to put that thinking in a box under a fuselage. The German searchlights swept on through the darkness, faithful and powerful and temporarily blind, while somewhere in the black water ahead, a torpedo was already running toward its target. It is perhaps the most apt image available for the whole quiet, unglamorous, consequential business of finding small advantages in large wars, the light shining perfectly and seeing nothing.